Welcome to episode 4 of the Roterota podcast. I'm Roterota, and unfortunately, I had recorded an interview, but in my infinite wisdom, I unfortunately forgot to put the audio from my side in. So, unfortunately, it's a one-sided interview at the moment with a really incredible professor and public intellectual and great TikToker, Ollie Mold. So, definitely go follow him. So, big apologies to Ollie, and I will figure something out on that end. So, let's be a little bit more constructive. In the last few days, since we had our last episode where I talked to Sneakrit about some less world-shattering stuff, it has become apparent that the Atlantic Order has continued to fracture at an accelerated rate. We saw the meeting between Volodymyr Zelensky and Trump and J.D. Vance last week that explosively resulted in what was clearly Trump showing that his great passion and love and care is for Vladimir Putin over America's longtime allies. And this led to an immediate emergency security conference led by Prime Minister Keir Starmer of the UK, where he brought together several world leaders from around Europe and elsewhere to start talking about the post-US defensive structure. Unfortunately, what came out of that meeting was kind of more of the same, unfortunately. There wasn't much new ground tread, and it seems the Prime Minister and all of the other European leaders are still premised on the idea that they can get the United States on side. And this, I don't know if this is just a public face that they're having, but if it is what they are thinking in private, I think this is very dangerous because it seems they still don't understand how different things are now in this Trump, J.D. Vance, MAGA world that we live. The idea that we can still hope for the U.S. to be a responsible ally and partner in some sort of peace in Ukraine or a peacekeeping force it's naive at best, I'll be totally honest. One of the other things that I keep thinking about is how fast it's all shifting. And it seems that a lot of people are holding on to a world that just no longer exists. We are far, far past what happened at the Munich Security Conference, and that alone was earth-shattering. If that was all that happened in the month of February, it would have been enough. But we are miles past that, and we're into unknown territory. And yet, politicians, institutions, people online are grasping on for that yesterday. And the longer it takes for people to come to terms with it, the longer it'll take for us to make the choices and changes needed for us to be able to survive this new world. And that really, really scares me. I've also keep looking out at the United States, and I'm deeply, deeply concerned because while I see a lot of incredible and inspirational resistance, the institutions are crumbling. The ones that weren't already horribly damaged from the last decade of dealing with MAGA. But at the same time, you see the one political party, the one opposition party failing repeatedly to really do anything to halt what is occurring around them. There's an ongoing coup, and more often than not, you've seen senior Democratic leaders working hand in hand and preaching about the need for bipartisanship, or even expecting Republicans to break with Donald Trump after they've moved in lockstep with him to appoint the most extreme members of his cabinet so far. It's deeply worrying to see also online, for example, many Americans just going about their days as normal or treating things as not important, not understanding the republic is collapsing around them. It makes you really understand those last days in the Weimar Republic. And when we question how could they not see it coming, we can watch live now. Americans caring more about complaining about British food and cuisine than about the collapse of their constitutional republic. And it really shows how bizarre it is. For example, last night, the Academy Awards were on. And while there were some political statements said, at the end of the day, this is bread and circuses being watched by the rest of the world while the coup is still ongoing. And it's a very surreal thing to imagine, to really recognize is going on. But it is. One of the other things that I think should be reflected on is the importance of solidarity and understanding that this is a time for people to come together. I think there has been a very strange happening, not just in Europe, but internationally and between places, that people are using the destruction of the old world to brag and have joy over the suffering or potential suffering of others. Especially this argument around being happy that Russia might win in Ukraine because of European colonization. And this is such a bizarre position that I see constantly being put into my replies and comments that I sit there wondering, what colonial empire do they think the Ukrainians had, or anyone in Eastern Europe? I mean, it's an absurd and bizarre thing. The colonizer of Eastern Europe was the Russian Empire, and it is an empire that spanned all the way to border North Korea and China. I mean, you can't get more colonial than having a planned empire that stretches all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The other thing that's making me very frustrated and angry in this particular moment in time is seeing so many people act as bystanders in the middle of a reactionary revolution that is happening all over the world, and especially in the United States, where people continue to go about their days like nothing is occurring or disconnecting entirely. And the reality is that you're a bystander. It's almost worse than you being a collaborator, because you see it all going on and you just choose to do nothing. And your silence is compliance in that new order. It is an admission by default that you are fine with that order existing. And when that order taking place, that new MAGA dominance taking place, is going to cause, and has caused already, death and destruction around the world. It's honestly terrifying, and it reminds you how something like the Holocaust could occur, because it was just so many bystanders who just let it happen in front of them. They saw it happening, and they kept going about their day. That's what I think about when I watch people complaining about discourse or talking about whatever. What are you doing? This is the death of your country happening around you, and you're posting about food. It seems weird and strange, but I guess that's what it's like to watch a democracy die. They won't know until it already has happened. The people could have never imagined that the last election they voted in would be the last election, because there's no great moment where it switches from one to the other. The democracy is just not there one day. It just isn't, because it's been slowly eroded, and people have let it be so. I really just think about these protests in Georgia, Ukraine during the Maidan. These people stood up to governments that used incredible violence against them, disappeared people off the streets, shot people, killed people. And they still stood up in huge amounts, in numbers, in ratios that are unheard of in other countries. And they still stood up. So what does it say to the countries where protest is rare, where rights can be eroded, and it barely makes a peep or maybe only a small wave? It really scares me, because it makes us think. It makes us be conditioned to believe that change actually cannot occur, that you cannot actually get out into the streets and do anything, that it's much better to sit back and watch something on the television or your hand. So let's actually talk about something perhaps hopeful, or at least not incredibly negative. Austria has a new government, and it's not one with the far right. This is a big deal, because for several months since the October elections of last year, and if you check the calendar now, it's March of 2025. Yeah, so the far right won big. It got into first place, but every other party said that it didn't want to work with them. The uvp, which was the second largest party and the party that was currently holding the chancellorship, said, well, we're going to try and form a government with the SPU, the Social Democrats, and the NEOs, the neoliberal party. And it's really, really funny and stupid at the same time. So basically, there were a bunch of negotiations that happened. It basically came to a head because of a couple of issues. So there is a debt limit issue so if you're not aware, the European Commission and the European Union has rules around how large of a deficit and debts countries can run, and they are very strict about this. And so Brussels was finally cracking down on this in several countries, Austria being one of them. And so Austria had to figure out a way to come up with a bunch of money, or make a bunch of cuts and make a bunch of money, or just make a bunch of cuts and tank the economy. So The SPU, the Social Democrats, were like, all right, well, let's just do some minor taxes and make them more on the wealthiest people, and we'll just do a little banking tax, and that's how we'll solve it. Little wealth tax, little banking tax. Bing, bang, boom. It would be enough to raise all the money they'd need, and there wouldn't need to be any cuts. They could do some stuff like raising salaries and things for public workers, stuff that's normal. It's like you need to have more revenue generated. You go to the richest people in the country and you're like, you could pay a little bit more. It's not a radical position. Well, conservatives obviously were not having this because they're just against the idea of having any new taxes. And for the most part, the neos went along with this idea to be against taxes. And instead, the counterproposal came from the conservatives, and they were saying, well, how about we just cut every single public worker's pay effectively? So teachers, nurses, you name it, they were like, let's just cut. And the Social Democrats were like, you have to be out of your mind. We're not going to make public workers get paid less. Like, obviously, this is ridiculous because people are already in a cost of living crisis. We've had inflation, blah, blah, blah. Like, these people are already hurting. This will just make things worse. And this is like very similar to what we're seeing like in this Elon Musk Doge approach to running a government. The idea, stupid idea, is that like a government can't pay for things, and that a government should just not pay for things, and then magically the economy will just work. And if this just sounds very familiar, that's just because it's neoliberalism just like cranked up to 11. And this is frustrating, right? Because the solution's quite easy, and they're presented with a solution, and they choose not to do it. So they break off the coalition talks. First the neos leave, and then the conservatives leaves, and then the SPU are the only adults in the room with an actual plan that could work and not really harm anyone. Then we have a situation where the conservatives, the uvp, get to now have an attempt to form a government with the far-right Freedom Party of Austria. So the Freedom Party of Austria is an interesting organization, to say the least. So the FPÖ was founded by former members of the National Socialist Party of Austria, and specifically SS members. It was formed in the heady days of the 1950s after the collapse of an earlier post-war Nazi organization and political party. And it's a neo-Nazi party. What can you say about it? And it's currently led by a guy named Herbert Kickl, who goes by the Volkskanzler, as in what Hitler called himself before he called himself Führer. And if you want to know all the goss about them, Jan Böhmermann has a ton of videos detailing all the sordid absurdities of that particular political party. So they went into negotiations with the conservatives, and they seemed to be stalled for a while. And then eventually the newspaper came out with the demands of the Freedom Party for them to form a government with the conservatives. And they were bonkers crazy. Like, I cannot get this past you. They want like Austria out of the EU. There to be a blockade with the EU. They wanted to remove themselves from the WHO. There was just like a bunch of really bizarre and wild things. They wanted to leave the euro. They really pushed for some really extreme ideas. And also, oh man, yeah. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but the big thing like lighting up the far right and right now is to lower the age for people to be considered adults in criminal law. And they want to bring it down to 12. Yes. Yeah, so that's like a whole thing. And anyway, but the thing that broke the camel's back wasn't all that stuff. I mean, that stuff was pretty bad. So the thing that broke off the second set of coalition negotiations was the reality that the FPÖ also wanted to have a tax on the banks. And more importantly, they wanted to, and forgive me how arcane this is going to sound, but there is a chamber of commerce in Austria, like in most countries. But this one has significantly more power than most countries would have. And this is because the Chamber of Commerce exists as effectively a balancing system within the Austrian political body, which in the post-war setup was designed to allow for the conservatives and the Social Democrats to have co-equal, effective institutional power in the country so that there wouldn't be a repeat of what led to the Civil War that led to the fall of the First Republic of Austria. And this means that the Chamber of Commerce has a big institutional role that is tied into how the state functions. Its equal and opposite body is the Arbeiterkammer, so like the workers' Congress. And this is a very important pillar, both of them, of Austrian society, economics, the whole shebang. Well, businesses are required to be in this Chamber of Commerce by law, and the FPÖ wanted to make it so that they would not be required to do this, which would effectively make it so potentially the FPÖ could set up a competing body, which would allow the ÖVP's political power and institutional authority that is default into the current setup to be slowly whittled away. And this is literally exactly what the far right did in the First Republic. They would make parallel structures to what the Social Democrats and the Conservatives had and slowly start accruing more and more people into them. And this obviously was a big red flag for the ÖVP because they realized, oh, the FPÖ actually wants us to like completely be destroyed within the Austrian body politic, which is, like they're the far right. Did you think just because you're also conservative that they would allow your political party to exist forever? No, they want absolute power. Like, are you guys idiots? So this led to a whole bunch of things happening. The collapse of the first round of negotiation led to the old chancellor, Karl Nehammer, and leader of the Conservative Party, to step down. Then a new guy came up, Christian. Christian then failed and left the negotiations with the FPÖ because obviously he wasn't going to go along with their laundry list of crazy ideas. And this honestly would have been impossible to get through the parliament either. Like, you have to remember, like, the FPÖ was first, but they only got a little over 30%. So this isn't some crazy mandate to change the constitution and to do things like leaving the EU, which is not a popular position in Austria in the first place. So we get to a situation where now we're like several months into multiple coalition negotiations. And then the SPÖ leader, who during this whole time, so I have to introduce you to Andy Babler. Andy Babler is the new leader of the SPÖ. The SPÖ is the Social Democratic Party of Austria. And Andy Babler is the mayor of Traiskirchen, and now he is the party leader. He came from outside of Vienna, which has traditionally controlled the senior level governing structures of the SPÖ. So his rising to the top as someone outside of that Viennese bubble was a big shock to the system. And effectively, he is the first real, left-wing leader of the SPÖ in a very, very, very long time. And some might even argue the first one ever in the Second Republic. And this is a big, big deal because not only do we see now a regional shift in power within the SPÖ itself's governing structure, we see a direct shift away from the neoliberal era of the SPÖ that has dominated for a couple of decades into a more traditional and forward-looking approach to social democratic policy, which brings back the importance of the old school trade unionism and focus on social programs and all these things, but also updates it to the modern era, talking about climate and much of the other important things that we are facing in this modern era. This is also a big deal because he was able to get the strong loyalty of the trade unions, which allowed him to be able to get a large amount of legitimacy across the entire social democracy. And when I say social democracy, this is referring to the wide range of institutions and organizations that are inside the orbit of the Social Democratic Party. So so just imagine a whole bunch of different groups and organizations, some with large amounts of members doing a whole bunch of different things that are all tied in one way or another into the SPÖ. And as everything in Austria is effectively divided into something either attached to the SPÖ or the ÖVP, and to a lesser extent, the FPÖ, everything in the whole country effectively is attached in some way to one of these big ideological blocks and political blocks of what's going on in the country. And Babler was able to, in a way not seen yet, or not really seen in a very long time, we can say, to use all of these networks to build up a massive coalition of people who believed in the politics and vision he was selling. So let's bring us back a little bit. So Babler came out, and you have to understand, and the first probably about year of him being the leader of the SPÖ, he was constantly criticized for, appearing as he was, as a small city mayor who was a man of the people, who came across as, a trade unionist wearing like work jackets, being out, going, doing stuff, that he didn't look like a serious politician. And this is code for he doesn't wear nice enough suits. And so for a lot of the last few months leading up to the election and after during the negotiations, he made a big effort to present himself in every single public meeting as someone who looked like the chancellor, wearing nice suits, being very proper and formal, and effectively making himself appear like a man who could be the leader of the country. And this, I think, was very important in the theater of these multi-month-long negotiations, because during the entire process, he made himself look like the responsible actor, regardless of what the media was saying about him. And I think this was very important because every step of the way, as the UVP effectively failed in the first negotiation, second negotiation, and then eventually succeeded in these third negotiations, Andy Bablu was constantly out there trying to be the constructive partner, saying, we are willing to do this, or maybe we can do that, or we're willing to reopen negotiations for a coalition, and never allowing, for example, himself to be portrayed as non-constructive, which I think was like super, super, super important. So Bablu comes out of this looking good, looking like a chancellor, and now he has managed to land himself in the vice chancellorship in a three-way coalition between himself, the UVP, and the Neos. So effectively, that first coalition agreement came into existence. It just took 6 months and another set of coalition agreements failing to, will it into being. And now Austria sits on a 5-year clock of a three-way coalition of conservatives, liberals, and social democrats to effectively right the country and figure out a way to dismantle the far-right tide that has taken over a huge amount of power in the country. And we have to understand, Austria is a federal system, and they have Länder elections, so elections amongst the states constantly going on. And not only that, then we have local elections happening in Vienna soon and across the country. And it's very important to understand that every time one of these elections comes up, it's another attempt for the ep4, the far right, to gain control and gain power. And one of the main takeaways over the last few years is that the UVP has been repeatedly damaged, not just by their like terrible performance in government and the nonstop scandals that they have, which is like a whole thing in itself, but they have not been able to do anything to stop the constant leaking of voters from themselves all the way to the FPÖ. And more importantly, they have not made any attempt to go after non-voters like the FPÖ has in such a successful way. And the same problem and critique is also levied at the Social Democrat, who for years also did not approach trying to get all these non-voters, which allowed the FPÖ a huge amount of freedom to spend years going after people and cultivating them into their politics. And now we are seeing what years of effort into converting non-voters into voters is able to accomplish. It can bring you into first place. It can double your vote share like we saw in Germany, where the AfD did the exact same strategy. We have seen the same thing with Reform UK, with Nigel Farage going after explicitly non-voters. It is also how Donald Trump won the 2024 election, going after non-voters. This is the strategy, and we need to keep reminding politicians that the people who don't vote can start voting, and that is where energy needs to be put into. So this is going to be an interesting time in Austria, and I think we can be very cautiously optimistic. I also think we gotta not believe that this coalition is going to probably last the full 5 years. I really just do not see any UVP government lasting that long. If you're not an Austria follower, you will be aware that we're getting close to the double-digit amount of governments that we've had in the last decade, and so that's not super good. This is like a old school Italian levels of governmental collapse. We're not at Bulgaria levels though. They're still the election kings. And yeah, it's going to be a crazy time. But honestly, I think there's some stuff to be optimistically cautious about. So yeah, like it sucks that the UVP has a lot of the important ministries. They still retain interior. Now they have climate. Not great. But at the same time, the Neos finally have education, something they've been yearning for forever. And it is something they are deeply passionate about. So we'll see if they're able actually to turn their effectively reason for existing as a party into really good policy that actually improves education for people in Austria. We'll see what happens. They have never been in government before, but who knows? At the same time, the SPU has the finance ministry, and that is a huge deal because if you know your SPU First Republic history, the clever use of financing mechanisms to build up social policies and the social democratic structures was what led to that party becoming so vital and important in Austrian politics to this day. People in Austria effectively live in the wake of the innovations of what was done by the SPU. The ideas around social housing or education, these are things that came out of this idea of how do we use progressive taxation to build a better society around ourselves. And for me, this kind of gives me a little tiny bit of hope that if the SPU can really use the finance ministry to right the country and provide funds to do a bunch of ambitious things, there could be really, really amazing times in the future for Austria. And there can lead to a big revival of the SPU as a force in the country that doesn't have to be the junior partner in a coalition or ignored sometimes, but can finally lead again. And for me, I really, really hope that that will happen. At the same time, we've seen that the vice chancellorship given to Andy Babla also includes basically every single policy position and job that was not included in any of the other ministries. But most importantly, housing. I think it's quite fated that the SPU leader is also the de facto housing minister. And that is going to be quite important to change how Austrians understand their neighbors and neighborhoods, and especially asylum seekers and migrants. Because if housing pressure are taken off, if housing is used to build good social cohesion across the country, it will take a lot of the steam out of the lies of the far right. And that is really something with finance, and Andy Babla's oversight over housing can really change things in the next election if they move fast and the ÖVP doesn't stand in front of them actually getting things done. So I do have a quiet hope and optimism for Austria, but at the same time, we have to understand that this isn't an ideal situation either. Yet, I think one other thing is important to remember. The SPU has been losing a lot of votes for a lot of years, and this was one of the first elections where we saw that either stabilize at a bottom around 20% and even slowly tick back up. And I think that's really important to realize that the ÖVP is still shedding votes, like so many votes all the time in every Landa. They're still being crushed, but it seems that the end of the decline might be here. It might be a little optimistic for me to state, but the end of the decline might be here for the SPU. And this is the rebuilding process. There is joy to being back in government, and there is opportunity there. But it is also a big danger being in any relationship with the ÖVP, who are known not to be trusted and just get into every scandal you can imagine. It's a bit absurd. Yeah, that's Austria, and it's a crazy time. But honestly, it is so good that the FPU is non-government. I was so worried about that. I know so many people were terrified, but we have 5 years at best, maybe more realistically like 2 to 3. So let's figure out what we can do in the next 24, 36 months. And a lot of things are going to have to change in Austria. We live in a much more dangerous world. It's not just about domestic issues. It's about everything. And that means that people are going to need to lead and lead big. And not only that, we need to make sure that a new generation of leaders is being pushed into the spotlight so that they can step up and step in when they're needed. So one other thing I'd like to reflect on is this fallout from the Oval Office battle, basically, where Donald Trump and J.D. Vance jumped Volodymyr Zelensky. And then the immediate reaction, the impromptu defense conference in London, the oncoming one this week in Brussels this Thursday, and the reality that I think leaders are still not understanding American detachment. This is very worrying to me because after Keir Starmer came out of his event on Sunday, it became quite aware, or rather, it became quite clear that he still thinks that he can get the U.S. back on side. And I find this really naive at best. It's deeply worrying. And I don't know if this is just a public strong face. I really wanted to just be a public facing thing, but also seeing that, for example, there's been a lot of critique, praise, but also bigger critique about Rachel Reeves, the chancellor in the UK. So this is the person overseeing the money. And she released the interest on money that has been seized by the Russian Federation since the beginning of the war that the UK has. And this is quite a large amount of money. I think it's a little north of 30 billion pounds. But instead, she released this money to be used by Ukraine and Britain for the defense of Ukraine, but only the interest on the money. And then she released it as a loan that would have to be paid back. And this really honestly like reeks of this insane idea that you can have a neoliberal approach to defense spending, and then also that this Russian money and the interest on that money should eventually just go back to Russia, which is a bizarre position because we're going to need to raise so much money to pay for this defense buildup for the damage and the war that Russia is causing. Yet people like Rachel Reeves are still hesitant to use Russian money they have in their banks to literally pay for the war that Russia has caused. And at the same time, a much larger amount of money is sitting in the European Union, where the European Commission could decide to use, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. And this could be used to pay entirely for the defensive buildup and for Ukraine's defense for the near future. And yet, very little is being done around this. And we're years into this. And tens of billions of dollars and euros spent into this war. And yet we're still safeguarding Russian money. We're still safeguarding the spoils of the empire murdering people in the East. It still speaks to people not understanding the gravity of the situation, the dangerous world that we're in, and the short amount of time that we have left to do anything other to avert much worse futures. And if you want to achieve things in a quicker amount of time, you can only do that by adding more labor and more money into the situation so that you can hire more labor or do more things faster. Because you cannot add days. We do not have the ability to time travel. And using a large amount of money very, very quickly allows you to do a large amount of things very quickly. But for some reason, they still think that they have years to deal with these things and that they can do it on the cheap. And this will only result in much greater actual financial costs later. And sadly, the cost in human lives being more immense. And this deeply also scares me that they're still only having small group discussions around this when it affects every country. And by not including all the countries to all the decisions, it creates a situation where it will lead to disunity between an alliance that needs to be building stronger and stronger trust in a world that has had a great betrayal of the United States against all of its allies. And at the same time, it also speaks to the reality of Brexit, that Keir Starmer is not a part of the constant negotiation and communication that happens when being part of the European Union. And that because of this, he must continue to make external bodies to deal with problems that are being discussed every single day in Brussels, in Strasbourg, and across the Union in all the institutions, because there are permanent structures to deal with all of these things. And again, it speaks to his insane unwillingness to reorientate the UK back towards the European Union and forgo the insane policy of the Tories, and specifically the current booster of Donald Trump, Boris Johnson. It is madness to see him defend the Brexit, the policy that has weakened the UK, the Union, and the entire democratic world in this moment, after everything, after Munich, after the Oval Office battle, after everything. I really want Keir to wake up. He needs to be the leader that the world needs. And that means being part of Europe, not straddling still between the US and everyone else. It is an untenable position. And Donald Trump will not allow it himself. He views anything other than absolute loyalty as betrayal. And there is no amount of letters from the king that are going to change. Maybe also to leave you with something a bit more positive, I've been very warmed by the amount of international solidarity going on right now. the outpouring of love towards Ukraine, towards Canada, Mexico, Greenland, all these places being threatened by Trump, Panama. Unfortunately, the list continues to grow day by day. The people like myself pushing for boycotts of the United States goods and services are picking up steam. There's a lot of groups around the internet and people on Reddit and everywhere talking about alternative things that people can purchase and do, and lobbying that they can do for their governments or institutions to get them to detach from the US. And this is really inspirational. And I want to say it is what is keeping me going, seeing all these other people trying and doing their efforts in parts big and small to fight back against this tide of a reaction that threatens all of us. Because there will be another side to this. We have to have community, hope, and get up and build something. Not just sit back, not be a bystander. Because if we want something different, we have to build it ourselves. No one's going to do it for us. No one's coming to save us. We save each other. Thank you. Have a lovely day. And if it's in your heart, please, 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 please join our Patreon for a paid membership or donate on PayPal. It is incredibly important. I really would like to be able to hire a editor and or someone to do moderation, because you have no idea how awful it is to get like constant death threats all the time. So help out on that part, and we can start growing the Roto project to be bigger and bigger and making more content for all of you guys. And yeah, have a lovely week, even though the world is very rough.